My son's girlfriend told me I should rest more, so I disappeared from their wedding completely. The silence that followed those words still echoes in my memory. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show them we're strong together. My name is Ellen Riley, and I'm 73 years old. I live in a sprawling Victorian house in Portland, Oregon, the same house where my late husband John and I raised our son Jason, where we hosted countless family gatherings, where every corner holds memories of a life built with love and sacrifice. The house sits on 3 acres of meticulously maintained gardens that I've tended for 47 years, each rose bush planted with my own hands, each stone pathway laid during weekends when John and I dreamed of the family legacy we were creating. This morning, like every morning for the past 6 months, I stood at my kitchen window watching the sunrise paint the mountains pink while my arthritic fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had seen better days. The kitchen still smells of cinnamon and vanilla from yesterday's baking. Cookies I made for Jason and his fiancée Claire. Cookies that sat untouched on the counter until they grew stale. The silence in this house has become so thick I can almost taste it, heavy with the weight of words unspoken and love unacknowledged. My daily routine has become a careful choreography of loneliness. I wake at 5:30, make coffee in the same pot I've used for 20 years, and sit at the kitchen table where Jason used to eat his breakfast before school. The wooden table bears the scars of his childhood, crayon marks, knife scratches from art projects, and a small burn mark from when he tried to make me breakfast in bed for Mother's Day when he was 12. I run my fingers over these imperfections while I drink my coffee, remembering the boy who used to tell me everything, who came to me with scraped knees and broken hearts, who once said I was his best friend in the whole world. The house feels too big now, too quiet, too full of ghosts. Every room tells a story of the family we used to be. The living room where Jason and I would watch movies on Friday nights, sharing a bowl of popcorn and debating plot twists. The dining room where we celebrated every birthday, every graduation, every small victory and major milestone. The front porch where I taught him to tie his shoes, where we carved pumpkins every Halloween, where he brought Claire to meet me for the first time 3 years ago. I remember that day with painful clarity. Claire was beautiful, 28 years old with honey blonde hair and the kind of confidence that comes from never having doubted your place in the world. She wore a cream-colored sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and she smiled with perfect white teeth while shaking my hand with fingers soft as silk. "Mrs. Riley," she said in a voice like wind chimes, "Jason has told me so much about you. This house is absolutely charming. So vintage and authentic. Vintage. Authentic. As if I were a museum piece rather than a woman who had poured her heart into creating a home." Jason beamed with pride as he showed her around, pointing out family photos and sharing stories about his childhood. He seemed so happy, so complete, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't experienced since John's death 5 years earlier. Maybe this was the beginning of the next chapter. Grandchildren playing in the same yard where Jason had learned to ride his bike, family dinners filling this house with laughter again, a daughter-in-law who would appreciate the love that had built this foundation. But as the months passed, something shifted. Jason's visits became less frequent, his phone calls shorter and more dutiful. When he did come by, Claire was always with him, and she had a way of steering conversations away from memories and toward their future plans. Plans that never seemed to include me beyond the periphery. She would compliment my cooking while subtly suggesting healthier alternatives, admire my garden while mentioning how much easier a modern landscape would be to maintain, and praise my decorating while describing the minimalist aesthetic she preferred. 6 months ago, they announced their engagement during Sunday dinner at my table. I had spent the entire day preparing Jason's favorite meal, pot roast with garlic mashed potatoes, green beans from my own garden, and apple pie made from the recipe my mother had passed down to me. The dining room was set with my best china, the chandelier casting warm light over the mahogany table that had hosted our family's most important moments. "Mom," Jason said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "Claire and I have something to tell you." His eyes were bright with excitement, and for a moment, He looked exactly like the little boy who used to burst through the front door after school, eager to share every detail of his day. I felt my heart flutter with anticipation. "What is it, sweetheart?" Claire extended her left hand, revealing a diamond ring that caught the light like captured starlight. "We're engaged!" she announced, her voice bubbling with joy. I should have felt pure happiness. I should have jumped up to embrace them both, should have cried tears of joy, should have immediately started planning celebrations. Instead, I felt a strange hollow sensation in my chest, as if something precious had been taken from me without my knowledge. Not the engagement itself. I wanted Jason to be happy, wanted him to find the kind of love I had shared with his father. But the way they told me, the formality of it, the sense that I was being informed rather than included, made me feel like a stranger receiving news about distant relatives. "That's wonderful," I managed, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my face. "I'm so happy for you both." But even as I spoke the words, I could see the distance in Jason's eyes, the way he looked at me as if I were someone he needed to manage, rather than someone he wanted to share his joy with. Claire thanked me graciously for dinner while checking her phone, already moving on to the next item on their evening's agenda. That night, after they left, I sat alone in my kitchen and cried for reasons I couldn't fully understand. The house felt larger and emptier than ever, filled with the echo of celebration that had somehow excluded the person who had loved Jason longest and deepest. Yesterday afternoon, everything changed with a single phone conversation that would shatter what remained of my illusions about my place in their lives. I was in my garden, deadheading roses in the late afternoon sun, when my phone rang. The garden has always been my sanctuary, the place where I can think clearly and find peace among the flowers I've nurtured for decades. Each plant tells a story. The climbing rose John gave me for our first anniversary, the lavender bushes I planted after Jason's birth, the herb garden I cultivated when I dreamed of teaching grandchildren about growing their own food. "Hi, Mom!" Jason's voice came through the speaker, casual and distracted. I could hear traffic in the background, the sound of a life lived at full speed without time for lingering conversations. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, settling onto the wooden bench John had built beneath the apple tree. "How are the wedding plans coming along?" There was a pause, and I heard him talking to someone else. Claire, I assumed, before he returned to our call. "That's actually why I'm calling. Claire and I have been talking, and we think maybe you should take a step back from the planning. You've been doing so much, and Claire's worried you're wearing yourself out." The words hit me like cold water. I had been doing so much. I had offered to help with invitations and been told they were hiring a professional calligrapher. I had suggested we use my grandmother's china for the reception and been informed they preferred a more modern aesthetic. I had volunteered to make the wedding cake, something I'd dreamed of doing since Jason was born, and been told they had already booked a bakery in downtown Portland. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly have I been doing that's too much?" Another pause. More muffled conversation in the background. When Jason spoke again, his tone was gentler, but somehow more devastating. "Mom, you know we appreciate everything you want to do, but Claire thinks maybe you should rest more. Focus on taking care of yourself. We've got everything under control. Rest more. Focus on taking care of yourself." The phrases echoed in my mind like accusations, as if my offers to help had been burdens rather than expressions of love. As if my desire to be involved in my only child's wedding was evidence of inability rather than devotion. I ended the call without saying goodbye, my hands shaking as I set the phone down on the weathered bench. The garden suddenly felt foreign around me, the roses I had tended with such care seeming to mock my efforts with their perfect, indifferent beauty. That evening, I sat in John's old armchair, the burgundy leather recliner where he used to read the newspaper every evening after dinner, and tried to make sense of what was happening to my life. The chair still smells faintly of his cologne, and sitting in it usually brings me comfort, a sense of connection to the man who understood me better than anyone else ever has. But last night, it only emphasized how alone I had become. I thought about the past 45 years, about the sacrifices I had made gladly and without question, the nights I stayed up with sick babies, the birthdays and holidays I made magical through sheer force of will and love. The college tuition I paid by working double shifts at the hospital where I was a nurse for 30 years. I thought about the dreams I had deferred, the opportunities I had declined, the pieces of myself I had given away to build a family that now seemed eager to function without me. The photo albums sat on the coffee table where I had left them weeks ago, when I thought I might put together a display for the wedding reception. Pictures of Jason's childhood, of family vacations, of Christmas mornings and graduation days. In every photo, I could see my own face glowing with pride and joy, completely unaware that someday the boy I was raising would grow into a man who found my love overwhelming rather than precious. As I turned the pages, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. In the recent photos, the ones from the past few years since Claire entered our lives, I appeared less and less frequently. Holiday gatherings where I was cropped out or standing at the edges, family dinners where the camera seemed to focus on everyone except me, birthday celebrations where I was the photographer rather than the subject. I had been disappearing gradually, so slowly that I hadn't noticed until the process was nearly complete. The realization settled over me like a cold fog, and I understood with terrible clarity that yesterday's phone call hadn't been the beginning of my exclusion. It had been the final, formal notification that I was no longer needed or wanted in the family I had created with my own blood and tears and sleepless nights of worry and love. That night, after the phone call that reduced me to a burden to be managed, I found myself walking through my house like a ghost, revisiting the scenes of her former life. Each room whispered accusations I had been too blind to hear before. How long had I been unwanted? How many years had my love been tolerated rather than treasured? I stopped at Jason's old bedroom, the door slightly ajar as I had kept it since he moved out 12 years ago. The room remained exactly as he had left it. Baseball trophies gathering dust on shelves I still polished weekly, posters of athletes whose names I had memorized because they mattered to him, a twin bed with the blue plaid comforter I had sewn by hand when he turned 16 and declared himself too old for cartoon sheets. Standing in that doorway, memories crashed over me like waves against a crumbling seawall. I remembered the night Jason came home from his first Little League tryout, tears streaming down his 8-year-old face because the other boys had better gloves, newer cleats, uniforms that fit properly. John was working overtime at the construction company, trying to save for the down payment on this very house, and our budget had no room for athletic equipment that cost more than our weekly grocery allowance. That night I stayed up until 3 a.m, hunched over my sewing machine in the kitchen, altering a secondhand uniform I had found at a thrift store. I replaced every button, hemmed the pants to fit his small frame perfectly, and embroidered his initials on the sleeve with thread I unraveled from an old pillowcase. When he woke up the next morning and found the uniform laid out on his dresser, his face lit up as if I had handed him the moon. "Mom, it's perfect," he had said, hugging me so tightly that I could smell the Johnson's baby shampoo I still used on his hair. "You're the best mom in the whole world." I had felt invincible in that moment, capable of moving mountains if it meant seeing that smile on his face. The memories multiplied as I moved through the house, the kitchen, where I had packed his lunch every school day for 12 years, always including a handwritten note tucked beside his sandwich. "Have a great day, sweetheart." Or, "Remember you're braver than you believe." Or simply, "Love, Mom," with a heart drawn in purple ink because purple was his favorite color until he turned 13 and decided it wasn't cool anymore. I remembered the parent-teacher conferences where Mrs. Henderson, his third-grade teacher, told me that Jason kept every single note I had written him in a special box in his desk. "He shows them to other children," she said with a smile. "He's very proud of having a mother who writes to him every day." Where was that box now? When had he stopped saving my notes? When had my daily expressions of love become embarrassing reminders of a childhood he was eager to leave behind? The living room held its own painful treasures. The piano I had bought with 3 months of overtime shifts when Jason expressed interest in music lessons at age 9. It was an old upright that required professional tuning every few months, an expense I had gladly absorbed because watching him play simple melodies filled me with a joy I had never experienced before motherhood. He practiced diligently for 2 years, his small fingers stretching to reach octaves that seemed impossible for his size. The piano bench still held his old music books, pages yellowed and corners dog-eared from use. Für Elise, marked with pencil notations in my handwriting, helping him remember which fingers to use for difficult passages. A collection of Disney songs we had played together, me providing simple harmony while he carried the melody. Christmas carols that had filled this house with music during holiday seasons, when we couldn't afford expensive decorations, but created magic through songs and homemade cookies and stories told by firelight. Jason abandoned the piano when he discovered baseball, and later, when high school social life consumed his attention. The instrument sat silent for years, gathering dust and slowly going out of tune. But I never sold it, never moved it, never stopped hoping that someday he might sit down and play again, might remember the afternoons when music had been our shared language. Now I realized the piano had become another monument to love unreturned, another symbol of how completely I had invested myself in dreams that apparently mattered only to me. The basement still housed boxes of Jason's childhood artwork, every single drawing and painting and clay sculpture he had ever brought home from school. Other mothers threw these things away after a reasonable display period, but I had saved everything, convinced that each crayon masterpiece was evidence of his developing genius, each finger painting a treasure worthy of preservation. I climbed down the wooden stairs that creaked under my weight, pulled the string that turned on the bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling, and opened the boxes I hadn't touched in years. Inside, carefully organized in chronological order, lay the artistic history of my son's childhood. Stick figures labeled "Me and Mom" in kindergarten handwriting. A Mother's Day card made from construction paper and macaroni with "I love you, Mom" spelled out in uneven letters. A clay ashtray he had made in 4th grade, even though neither John nor I smoked, because the art teacher said it was a useful gift for parents. Each item had seemed precious when he brought it home, his face glowing with pride as he explained his creative process. "This is you, Mom," he would say, pointing to a figure with yellow yarn hair and a triangle dress. "And this is me holding your hand." I had responded to every piece as if it belonged in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, displaying his work on the refrigerator with magnetic letters that spelled out, "Jason's Art Gallery." When had he stopped making art for me? When had he stopped caring whether I admired his creations? The transition had been so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint the moment when my approval ceased to matter to him. I thought about Jason's college years, when I had worked double shifts at Portland General Hospital to help cover his expenses. The state university offered partial financial aid, but there were still costs that stretched our budget beyond its limits. Textbooks, housing deposits, meal plans, activity fees that seemed to multiply every semester. John's construction work provided steady income, but not enough for the kind of college experience I wanted Jason to have. So I picked up extra shifts in the pediatric ward, working nights and weekends until exhaustion became my constant companion. I would come home after 16-hour shifts and find energy I didn't know I possessed to cook Jason's favorite meals when he visited, to listen to his stories about professors and classes and new friends who were opening his mind to possibilities I had never imagined for myself. During his sophomore year, Jason mentioned wanting to study abroad in London for a semester. The program cost $8,000 beyond his regular tuition, money we simply didn't have. I remember the conversation taking place in this very kitchen, Jason sitting at the table where he had done homework throughout his childhood, his face animated as he described the courses he could take, the museums he could visit, the perspective he could gain from living in another country. "I probably can't afford it," he said, resignation creeping into his voice. "But it would be amazing." That night, after he returned to his dorm, I sat down with our bank statements and calculated every possible source of additional income. I could sell my mother's jewelry, the small collection of modest pieces she had left me when she passed away 5 years earlier. I could take on private nursing shifts with elderly patients who needed overnight care. I could rent out our basement to a college student. I did all three. For 6 months, I worked 7 days a week, sleeping 4 hours a night, eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner to save money on groceries. The jewelry sale broke my heart. Those pieces were my only tangible connection to my mother's memory. But watching Jason board the plane to London made every sacrifice worthwhile. He sent postcards from museums and historic sites, his handwriting excited and grateful. "Thank you for making this possible, Mom," he wrote from the British Museum. "I'm learning so much. I love you." When he returned, he was transformed, more sophisticated, more worldly, filled with stories and perspectives that made our small Portland life seem provincial by comparison. I was proud of his growth, thrilled by his expanding horizons, even as I felt the distance that education and experience were creating between us. After graduation, Jason landed a job with a prestigious architecture firm in downtown Portland. The salary was better than anything John or I had ever earned, and I felt vindicated in every sacrifice I had made to give him opportunities we had never enjoyed. This was what love looked like. Not keeping your children close, but giving them wings to soar higher than you had ever dreamed possible. But success changed Jason in ways I hadn't anticipated. He moved to a modern apartment in the Pearl District, decorating it with furniture that cost more than my annual grocery budget. He joined a gym, bought expensive clothes, started dating women who worked in galleries and marketing firms and nonprofit organizations. Educated, accomplished women who made me feel suddenly aware of my own limitations. Our dinner conversations shifted from shared memories to his descriptions of wine tastings and art gallery openings and weekend trips to the coast with friends whose names I struggled to remember. I listened with genuine interest, proud of the life he was building, but increasingly aware that this life had no natural place for a woman who had never traveled beyond the Pacific Northwest, who bought her clothes at J.C. Penney, who considered a night out to be dinner at Applebee's. When he brought Claire home for the first time, I understood immediately that she represented everything I was not: polished, educated, comfortable with wealth, fluent in cultural references I didn't understand. She complimented my pot roast while describing the molecular gastronomy restaurant where she had celebrated her birthday. She admired my garden while mentioning the landscape architect who had designed her parents' estate in Lake Oswego. I tried to connect with her, asking about her work at the marketing firm, her interests, her family. But every conversation felt like a performance where I was poorly rehearsed for my role. She was kind but distant, polite but clearly unimpressed by the woman who had raised the man she loved. Over the following months, I watched Jason adapt his behavior to Claire's expectations. He stopped asking for my advice about work decisions, stopped sharing details about his social life, stopped calling just to talk. Our relationship became scheduled. Sunday dinners, birthday celebrations, obligatory holiday visits that felt more like duties than desires. The engagement party had been held at Claire's parents' house in Lake Oswego, a stunning modern home with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the lake. I had spent weeks planning what to wear, settling on a navy blue dress I had worn to 3 previous special occasions, my only pair of dress shoes polished until they gleamed. John had bought a new tie for the occasion, the first one he had purchased in 5 years. We arrived feeling hopeful and excited, ready to celebrate our son's happiness and welcome Claire's family into our lives. Instead, we spent the evening feeling like museum exhibits, interesting examples of working-class life, but not quite suitable for extended conversation. Claire's parents were gracious, but clearly puzzled by the vast differences in our lifestyles and perspectives. Claire's mother, Patricia, had asked about my career with the kind of polite interest that barely masked her assumption that nursing was somehow less valuable than her own work in hospital administration. Claire's father, Robert, had tried to engage John in conversation about sports, while obviously struggling to find common ground beyond the weather and traffic patterns. I had brought a photo album filled with pictures of Jason's childhood, thinking Claire's family might enjoy seeing the man they would soon call son-in-law as a gap-toothed little leaguer and proud high school graduate. The album sat unopened on the coffee table, ignored in favor of discussions about honeymoon destinations and career opportunities and investment strategies that required knowledge I had never acquired. That night, driving home in our aging Honda Civic while John muttered about pretentious people and overpriced wine, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. For the first time, I wondered whether my love for Jason would be enough to secure my place in the family he was creating. Was I used? The question had whispered itself in the dark corners of my mind for months, gaining strength each time Jason forgot to return my calls, each time Claire rearranged our conversations to exclude me, each time I felt more like an obligation than a cherished part of their lives. Now, standing in my empty house, surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime spent loving someone who seemed eager to outgrow me. The question demanded an answer I wasn't sure I was brave enough to face. The weeks following that devastating phone call became a masterclass in how love can die by 1,000 small cuts. Each day brought new evidence that I had become an inconvenience in the lives of the people I cherished most. A problem to be managed rather than a person to be valued. It started with my birthday 3 weeks later. 73 years old. A milestone that felt significant to me, heavy with the weight of decades lived and lessons learned. I had always celebrated birthdays as sacred occasions, marking not just the passage of time, but the accumulation of experiences that make us who we are. Jason's birthdays had been elaborate productions throughout his childhood, themed parties that required weeks of planning, homemade cakes decorated with whatever characters captured his imagination that year, carefully chosen gifts that reflected hours of listening to his current interests and dreams. For my 73rd birthday, I received a text message at 11:47 p.m. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry for the late message. Crazy day at work. Hope you had a good one. Jay." I stared at that message for 20 minutes, sitting in my darkened living room with only the light from my phone screen illuminating the tears that fell silently onto my flannel nightgown. 45 years of birthday celebrations, elaborate breakfasts in bed, surprise parties with neighborhood friends, thoughtful gifts chosen with care and wrapped with love, reduced to a hastily typed message sent as an afterthought when guilt finally penetrated his busy schedule. The worst part wasn't the lateness or the brevity. It was the assumption that I had celebrated somehow, that I had had a good one, with people who cared enough to acknowledge the day I was born. In reality, I had spent my birthday exactly as I spent every other day, alone in a house that felt increasingly like a mausoleum of memories no one else wanted to preserve. I had baked myself a small cake that morning, a simple yellow cake with chocolate frosting made from the same recipe I had used for Jason's birthday cakes throughout his childhood. I had eaten one slice while sitting at the kitchen table, looking at the empty chairs where a family should have been gathered. The remaining cake sat on the counter for 3 days before I finally threw it away, unable to bear the sight of celebration gone stale and unshared. The grocery shopping had become another form of torture. For decades, I had shopped with purpose and joy, filling my cart with ingredients for meals that would nourish the people I loved. I knew Jason's favorite foods by heart, his preference for chunky peanut butter over smooth, his love of my homemade mac and cheese, his request for chocolate chip cookies with extra chocolate chips. Shopping had been an act of love, each item chosen with specific recipients in mind. Now I wandered the aisles like a ghost, picking up items out of habit before remembering that no one was coming to dinner. No one would notice whether I bought Jason's favorite ice cream or Claire's preferred organic vegetables. My cart contained the sad collection of a woman cooking for one. Single servings of everything. Frozen dinners that required no preparation or thought. Ingredients for meals that could stretch across multiple days of eating alone. During one particularly devastating shopping trip, I encountered Linda Morrison, a woman I had known since Jason and her daughter Ashley were in elementary school together. Linda's cart was overflowing with party supplies, colorful streamers, balloons, a large sheet cake decorated with congratulations messages. "Ellen," she called out, her face bright with excitement. "How wonderful to see you. Ashley just got engaged and we're throwing her a surprise party this weekend. I'm sure you understand how thrilling it is when your child finds their person." I managed a smile that felt like breaking glass. "How wonderful for Ashley. I'm sure it will be a beautiful celebration." "Oh, it will be. Ashley's fiancé has such a lovely family. His mother and I have been planning together for weeks. We're already talking about grandchildren." Linda laughed, the sound genuine and full of anticipation. "I bet you and Claire's mother are doing the same thing. When is Jason's wedding again?" The question hit me like cold water. When was Jason's wedding? I realized with horror that I didn't know. The date had been mentioned in passing during one of our increasingly brief conversations, but no one had thought to ensure I had written it down, that I was keeping track of the most important day in my son's life. "It's in the spring," I said vaguely, hoping Linda wouldn't notice my uncertainty. "How exciting. I'm sure you're busy with all the planning." Mother of the groom has so many responsibilities. Linda's enthusiasm was genuine, making my exclusion feel even more shameful. I escaped that conversation as quickly as possible, abandoning my cart and fleeing to my car where I sat in the parking lot, crying until my hands stopped shaking enough to drive home safely. The discovery that shattered what remained of my illusions came through a source I never could have anticipated: Facebook, a social media platform I had joined years earlier primarily to see photos of high school friends' grandchildren and former patients who remembered to include me in their family updates. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late February, gray and drizzling in the way that makes Portland winters feel endless. I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of tea, scrolling through my phone without any particular purpose, when a post from Claire's college roommate appeared in my newsfeed. The photo showed Claire and Jason at what was obviously a wedding venue tour, standing in front of an elegant altar decorated with white roses and flowing silk. Claire wore a flowing sundress and held a notebook, clearly taking notes about details and logistics. Jason stood beside her in khakis and a button-down shirt, his arm around her waist, both of them smiling with the easy happiness of people planning their future together. The caption read, "So excited for Claire and Jason. Just finished touring the most gorgeous venue for their June wedding. Can't wait to celebrate these two lovebirds." June. Their wedding was in June, less than 4 months away, and I was learning this information from a stranger's social media post. My hands trembling, I scrolled through the comments, finding dozens of responses from friends and family members who were clearly involved in the planning process, who knew details about flowers and music and guest lists that had never been shared with me. Claire's aunt had commented, "The venue is perfect. Can't wait for the bridal shower next month." A bridal shower. Next month. An event that traditionally would include the groom's mother, an occasion where I should have been honored as a co-host, or at least an invited guest. Instead, I was learning about its existence through accidental social media discovery. I spent the next hour diving deeper into this digital revelation, finding photo after photo of planning sessions I hadn't been invited to, gatherings where decisions were being made about my son's wedding without any input from the woman who had given birth to him, raised him, sacrificed everything to give him the foundation that made this happiness possible. There were pictures from the cake tasting I had mentioned wanting to attend, images of Claire and Jason sampling elaborate confections while surrounded by both sets of parents. Except for me, there were photos from the florist consultation, the band audition, the menu planning session. In every image, families were represented by everyone except the woman who had loved Jason longest and deepest. The most devastating discovery was a group photo from what appeared to be an engagement party I had never heard about. Jason and Claire stood in the center, surrounded by 24 smiling faces. Claire's parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and close friends. Jason's side was represented by his college roommate and a few work colleagues. I was nowhere to be seen, erased from the celebration as completely as if I had never existed. I called Jason immediately, my heart pounding so hard I could barely hear his voice when he answered. "Mom, is everything okay? You sound upset." "Jason, I just saw photos on Facebook from your engagement party. When was this? Why wasn't I invited?" There was a long pause, followed by muffled conversation in the background. I could hear Claire's voice, though I couldn't make out the words. "Mom, that wasn't really an engagement party. It was just Claire's family gathering for her cousin's birthday, and they surprised us with a little celebration. It was very last minute, very casual. We didn't think—" "You didn't think what, Jason? You didn't think I would want to celebrate my only child's engagement? You didn't think I deserved to know that your wedding is in June? You didn't think I might like to participate in planning the most important day of your life?" My voice was rising despite my efforts to remain calm. 45 years of suppressed hurt finally finding its voice. "Mom, please don't make this dramatic. We've been busy with work and planning. We assumed you knew about the date. We must have mentioned it. And honestly, Claire's family has very specific ideas about how they want things handled. We're trying to keep things simple. Simple." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Simple meant without me. Simple meant pretending I didn't exist, didn't matter, didn't deserve a place at the table where my son's future was being decided. "I see," I said quietly. all the fight draining out of me as quickly as it had arrived. I understand, but I didn't understand. I couldn't comprehend how the boy I had loved without reservation could become a man who found my love burdensome, my presence inconvenient, my very existence something to be managed around rather than celebrated. That night I did something I had never done before in 45 years of motherhood. I opened a bottle of wine, the good bottle I had been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to arrive, and drank it while looking through photo albums of Jason's childhood. With each sip, each turned page, each memory of the boy who had once considered me his whole world, I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest. The love remained. That would never change, could never be diminished by neglect or indifference. But alongside the love, a new emotion was taking root, growing stronger with each excluded moment, each casual dismissal, each assumption that my feelings were less important than everyone else's convenience. Anger, not the hot, explosive anger that demands immediate satisfaction, but the cold, calculating anger of someone who has finally seen the truth clearly and is ready to do something about it. For the first time in my adult life, I was angry not at circumstances or situations, but at people I loved for treating me as if I didn't matter. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror before going to bed that night, studying the face of a woman who had spent 73 years putting everyone else's needs before her own, who had accepted crumbs of affection and called it a feast, who had allowed herself to become invisible in her own family. "What are you going to do about it, Ellen?" I asked my reflection. For the first time in months, I felt something other than sadness when I looked into my own eyes. I felt possibility. The woman staring back at me had raised a successful son, managed a household for decades, survived the death of her husband, and was still standing despite everything that had tried to break her spirit. That woman deserved better than to fade quietly into the background of other people's lives. That woman deserved to be seen, valued, and respected, or to make her absence so profound that they would finally understand what they had lost. I went to sleep that night with a question burning in my mind. What would happen if I simply stopped? Stopped trying so hard, stopped accommodating their convenience, stopped making myself available for whatever scraps of attention they were willing to offer. What would happen if I disappeared completely from their lives and forced them to confront what my presence had meant, not through dramatic confrontation or tearful accusations, but through the simple, devastating power of absence? For the first time in months, I fell asleep with something that felt dangerously close to hope. The silence that followed my decision to stop reaching out was deafening in ways I hadn't anticipated. For 3 weeks, I didn't call Jason. I didn't text him. I didn't send my usual Sunday evening messages asking about his week or offering dinner invitations that had become increasingly polite rejections. I simply stopped. The quiet in my phone was matched by the quiet in my heart. Not peace, but the terrible stillness that comes before a storm. On the 4th Friday of my self-imposed silence, my phone finally rang. Jason's name appeared on the screen at 6:30 p.m., and I stared at it for 4 rings before answering, my hand steady in a way that surprised me. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, using the same warm tone I had always used, as if nothing had changed. "Mom, is everything okay?" His voice carried a note of concern that would have once filled me with guilty relief. Now it simply felt like confirmation that my absence had finally been noticed. "I haven't heard from you in weeks. That's not like you. Not like me." The phrase settled in my chest like a stone. For 45 years, it hadn't been like me to put my own needs first, to stop reaching out when my calls weren't returned, to protect my own heart instead of constantly offering it up for casual indifference. "I'm fine, Jason. Just been keeping busy. How are you and Claire doing with the wedding planning? That's actually why I'm calling. We need to talk about some things. Can you come to dinner Sunday? Claire's making her grandmother's lasagna recipe." The invitation carried the tone of an appointment rather than a celebration, a summons disguised as hospitality. But I accepted anyway, curious to see what had prompted this sudden desire for my company. Sunday arrived gray and drizzling. Typical March weather in Portland that matched my mood as I drove to Jason's apartment in the Pearl District. The building was all glass and steel, aggressively modern in a way that seemed designed to announce that its residents had moved beyond the quaint sentimentalities of previous generations. I had helped with the security deposit for this place 3 years ago, writing a check that represented 2 months of my pension payments, because Jason's credit wasn't quite established enough to secure the lease on his own. Claire answered the door wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile was bright but somehow rehearsed, like an actress who had practiced her lines but wasn't quite comfortable with her role. "Ellen, so good to see you. Come in, come in. Jason's just finishing up some work emails, but he'll be right out." The apartment smelled like garlic and tomatoes, rich and inviting, but something in the air felt charged with tension I couldn't identify. Claire led me to the living room, where I perched on the edge of a leather sofa that was beautiful, but designed more for aesthetics than comfort. "Can I get you some wine? Or tea? I know you prefer tea." The fact that she remembered my beverage preference felt like a small kindness until I realized it was probably information gathered for strategic purposes rather than genuine care. "Tea would be lovely, thank you." While Claire busied herself in the kitchen, I looked around the apartment with fresh eyes. Every surface was immaculate, every piece of furniture perfectly positioned, every decoration chosen to create an atmosphere of sophisticated success. There were no photos of Jason's childhood, no mementos from our family history, no acknowledgement that he had existed before this carefully curated adult life. The only family photos displayed were recent ones, Jason and Claire at various social events, vacation photos from trips I had never heard about, professional portraits that looked like they belonged in a magazine spread rather than a home where people actually lived and loved and made messes. Jason emerged from his home office looking polished and professional even on a Sunday afternoon. He kissed my cheek with the obligatory affection of someone checking an item off a social duty list. "Sorry about that, Mom. Work never seems to stop these days." We settled around the dining table, where Claire served her grandmother's lasagna on plates that matched perfectly and probably cost more individually than my entire set of everyday dishes. The food was delicious, expertly prepared, but the conversation felt stilted and purposeful in a way that made every bite difficult to swallow. "So," Jason said after we had exhausted the safe topics of weather and current events, "Claire and I wanted to talk to you about the wedding." I set down my fork and gave him my full attention, though something in his tone made my stomach clench with anticipation. "We've been thinking," Claire interjected, her voice bright with forced enthusiasm, "about how to make sure everyone feels comfortable and included. And we know that big social events can be overwhelming, especially for—" She paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "For people who aren't used to that kind of scene. People who aren't used to that kind of scene." The euphemism hung in the air like an insult wrapped in tissue paper. "What Claire means," Jason continued, taking over when his fiancé's attempt at tact failed, "is that the wedding is going to be pretty formal. Black tie, seated dinner for 200 people, lots of Claire's family friends and professional contacts. We want to make sure you're comfortable." I looked between them, understanding beginning to dawn like a cold sunrise. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Claire leaned forward, her expression earnest in the way of someone delivering news they believed was kind. "We thought maybe you might prefer a smaller, more intimate celebration. Just close family. We could have a lovely brunch the day after the wedding, just the 4 of us. You, me, Jason, and my parents. Much more relaxed, more your style, more my style." The phrase was delivered with such gentle condescension that it took my breath away. They were uninviting me to my own son's wedding and presenting it as a thoughtful accommodation for my presumed social inadequacy. "Let me understand this correctly," I said, my voice remaining steady despite the earthquake happening in my chest. "You're asking me not to attend your wedding." "Not asking you not to attend," Jason said quickly. "Giving you an option that might be more comfortable for you. The reception is going to be very—" He gestured vaguely, searching for words that wouldn't sound insulting. "Very what, Jason?" "Sophisticated," Claire finished for him. "Lots of networking, business conversations, cultural references. We just thought you might feel more at ease in a smaller setting." The assumption underlying her words was devastating in its casual cruelty. They had decided that I was too unsophisticated, too provincial, too embarrassing to include in their carefully orchestrated celebration. The woman who had worked 3 jobs to pay for Jason's college education wasn't refined enough to witness his marriage to someone who considered refinement a birthright rather than an achievement. "I see," I said quietly. "And what gave you the impression that I wouldn't be comfortable at my own son's wedding?" Jason and Claire exchanged a look that communicated volumes. This conversation had been planned, rehearsed, strategized. They had discussed my social limitations, cataloged my inadequacies, and concluded that my presence would somehow diminish their special day. "Mom, it's not personal," Jason said, his tone taking on the patient explanation he might use with a confused child. "It's just that Claire's family has certain expectations. There will be governors, CEOs, cultural leaders. The guest list reads like Portland's power elite, and you're embarrassed by me." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread to every corner of the room. "It's not about embarrassment," Claire said quickly. "It's about making sure everyone has the best possible experience. We want this day to be perfect. Perfect. Without me." I looked at Jason, really looked at him, searching for any trace of the boy who had once cried when I was 5 minutes late picking him up from school because he thought I might not come back. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who found his mother's love inconvenient and her presence socially problematic. "What if I said no?" I asked quietly. "What if I said I want to attend my only child's wedding regardless of how sophisticated the guest list is?" Another exchanged look. Another moment of silent communication that excluded me completely. "Then of course you'd be welcome," Jason said. But his tone suggested this was the wrong choice, the selfish choice. The choice that would create problems he'd rather avoid. "But you'd prefer I didn't. We'd prefer you were comfortable," Claire said, her voice taking on a slight edge of impatience. "We're trying to be considerate of your feelings. My feelings." As if my feelings were the problem rather than their assumption that I wasn't worthy of inclusion in the most important day of my son's life. I set my napkin beside my plate with deliberate care, my movements slow and measured. "Thank you for dinner. And for the clarification about my place in your lives." "Mom, don't be dramatic," Jason said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We're trying to include you in a way that makes sense for everyone." "No," I said, standing up with dignity I didn't know I still possessed. "You're trying to exclude me in a way that makes you feel less guilty about it." I walked to the door, collected my coat from the closet, and turned back to face them one last time. They sat at their perfect table in their perfect apartment, looking at me with a mixture of irritation and relief, as if my departure solved a problem they hadn't wanted to address directly. "When you were 8 years old," I said to Jason, "you came home from school crying because Tommy Martinez said his mom made better cookies than I did. You were so upset that someone had criticized my baking that you couldn't eat dinner. You made me promise I'd never stop making cookies for you because mine were the best in the whole world." Jason's face flushed, but he didn't respond. "I still have that cookie jar in my kitchen," I continued. "It's still full, waiting for a little boy who apparently grew up to be ashamed of the woman who baked them." I left without another word, drove home through streets blurred by tears I refused to shed in their presence, and sat in my kitchen staring at the ceramic cookie jar shaped like a smiling bear. A Christmas gift from Jason when he was 12 years old. That night, I did something I had never done before. I called my lawyer. "Sandra," I said when she answered, "I need to talk to you about some legal matters. Can we meet this week?" "Of course, Ellen. Is everything all right?" I looked around my house. The house I had furnished with love, decorated with memories, maintained with pride for over 2 decades. The house Jason had grown up in, learned to walk in, brought his friends to throughout his childhood. The house where I had nursed John through his final illness, where I had grieved alone after his death, where I had continued to build a life that would always welcome my son home. "Everything's fine," I told Sandra. "I'm just ready to make sure my affairs are in order, to make sure the people I care about understand exactly what they mean to me." For the first time in months, I felt something that resembled power. Not the power to force love or demand respect, but the power to protect myself from people who had forgotten that love should never be conditional on someone's social acceptability. I was done being convenient. I was done being manageable. I was done accepting crumbs of affection from people who apparently viewed my love as something they were entitled to rather than something they had earned. If they wanted to treat me like a stranger, perhaps it was time to show them what life would look like if I actually became one. Sandra Chen's law office occupied the third floor of a converted Victorian house in northwest Portland, its warm wood paneling and oriental rugs creating an atmosphere of quiet competence that immediately put me at ease. I had known Sandra for 15 years, ever since I had helped her mother navigate the healthcare system during her battle with Alzheimer's. Sandra had never forgotten that kindness, and over the years our professional relationship had evolved into something closer to friendship. "Ellen," she said, rising from behind her mahogany desk to embrace me with genuine warmth, "you look different. Determined, maybe?" I settled into the leather chair across from her desk, feeling oddly calm for someone about to make decisions that would fundamentally alter her family relationships. "I need to protect myself, Sandra. And I need to send a message to people who seem to have forgotten that respect is not optional." For the next hour, I explained the situation with brutal honesty. The wedding on invitation disguised as consideration, the months of exclusion from planning, the casual assumption that my feelings were less important than their social comfort. Sandra listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail I shared. "What exactly do you want to accomplish?" she asked when I finished. "I want them to understand consequences," I said simply. "For 45 years, I've given unconditionally, and they've taken that generosity for granted. I want to show them what my absence actually means in practical terms." Sandra pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "Let's start with the obvious question. The house. You've mentioned that Jason assumes he'll inherit it, that he's made plans based on that assumption, but you've never actually promised him the property, have you?" I shook my head. "John and I always talked about leaving it to him eventually, but we never made it official. After John died, I kept meaning to update my will, but I trailed off, realizing how completely I had avoided dealing with my own mortality, as if ignoring it would somehow protect Jason from the eventual loss of another parent. So currently, your will leaves everything to Jason as your sole heir?" "Yes, but it's an old will, written when he was still in college, when I couldn't imagine him ever becoming the kind of person who would be embarrassed by his own mother." Sandra made more notes, her pen moving with the efficiency of someone who had helped many clients navigate the complicated intersection of family relationships and legal realities. "What about financial support? You mentioned helping with his apartment deposit, college expenses, other things over the years. Are you still providing any ongoing assistance?" I thought about the check I wrote every month to cover Jason's health insurance premium, a continuation of the family plan from when he was too young to secure his own coverage. The payments had continued even after he started earning more than I ever had, partly because he claimed the cost of individual insurance was prohibitive, and partly because maintaining that connection felt like preserving some vestige of his need for me. "I pay his health insurance," I admitted. "About $400 a month. He could afford his own coverage now, but it would cost him more than staying on my plan. Anything else?" "His cell phone is still on my family plan. The gym membership I got him for Christmas 3 years ago, I've been paying the annual renewal. Little things that probably add up to more than I realized." Sandra's eyebrows rose slightly. "Ellen, these aren't little things. You're subsidizing the lifestyle of a successful architect, while he simultaneously argues that you're not sophisticated enough to attend his wedding." Hearing it stated so plainly made the absurdity impossible to ignore. I was literally paying for the privilege of being treated as an inconvenience by someone who had no problem accepting my financial support while rejecting my emotional presence. "I want to stop," I said firmly. "All of it. I want to remove myself from his financial life as completely as he's removed me from his emotional life." Over the next 2 hours, Sandra and I crafted a plan that felt both empowering and terrifying. We would revise my will, establish new financial boundaries, and create legal documentation that would clarify exactly where I stood in relationships that had apparently been built on false assumptions. The new will was straightforward in its message. The house and property would be donated to the Portland Rose Garden Society upon my death, ensuring that the gardens I had tended for decades would be preserved and cared for by people who understood their value. The remainder of my estate would be divided between several charities, The Children's Hospital, where I had volunteered for years, a scholarship fund for nursing students, and a local organization that provided support for elderly people aging alone. Jason would inherit my personal belongings and family photographs, but the financial legacy he had counted on would instead benefit people who might actually appreciate the gift. "Are you sure about this?" Sandra asked as we reviewed the documents. "This is a significant decision, and it's difficult to walk back once family relationships are damaged." I thought about the question seriously, imagining Jason's reaction when he eventually learned about these changes. Would he be hurt? Angry? Would he finally understand that taking people for granted has consequences? Or would he simply see this as further evidence of my dramatic overreaction to reasonable social boundaries? "I'm sure," I said finally. "If someone only values you for what you can give them, then taking away your ability to give reveals the true nature of that relationship." That afternoon, I drove home with a stack of legal documents and a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. For the first time in my adult life, I had made decisions based purely on my own needs and values, rather than on what other people expected or wanted from me. The real test came the following Monday, when I made the phone calls that would implement my new boundaries. I started with Jason's health insurance company, explaining that I needed to remove him from my policy effective at the end of the current month. The customer service representative was helpful but confused. Apparently, it was unusual for parents to voluntarily remove adult children from coverage when the children weren't requesting the change. "Is your son aware that you're making this change?" she asked. "He will be," I replied. The cell phone company was next. Jason's line would be disconnected in 30 days unless he established his own account. The gym membership would not be renewed when it expired next month. Each phone call felt like cutting a thread that had bound me to obligations I had voluntarily assumed, but that had never been reciprocated with equal consideration. The strangest part of the process was how normal I felt while dismantling these connections. I had expected guilt, regret, second thoughts that would undermine my resolve. Instead, I felt increasingly clear about the difference between supporting someone you love and enabling someone who takes that love for granted. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked dinner just for myself, exactly the way I liked it. Salmon with lemon and herbs, roasted vegetables from my garden, a glass of wine from a bottle I had been saving for a special occasion that I now realized would never come unless I created it myself. I ate in my dining room, using the good china and crystal glasses that had been gathering dust in the cabinet, while I waited for events worthy of celebration. The candles I lit cast warm shadows on the walls, and for the first time in months, my house felt like a home rather than a museum of memories no one else valued. The silence was different now, not the hollow emptiness of abandonment, but the peaceful quiet of someone who had stopped waiting for other people to make her life meaningful. I was halfway through my salmon when the phone rang. Jason's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring 4 times before answering, savoring the knowledge that I was no longer desperate for any scrap of attention he might offer. "Hi, Mom." His voice carried a note of confusion that immediately made me suspicious. "I just got the strangest call from my insurance company. They said you were dropping me from your policy? That can't be right." "It's right," I said calmly, cutting another piece of salmon. "I've decided to simplify my financial obligations. You're successful enough to handle your own insurance now. But Mom, individual coverage is going to cost me almost twice as much as staying on your plan. It doesn't make financial sense." The irony was breathtaking. The same man who had excluded me from his wedding because I wasn't financially sophisticated enough to mix with his elite guest list was now arguing about the financial inconvenience of losing access to my resources. "I'm sure you'll figure it out," I said. "You're very good with money and planning. You'll find a solution that works for you. Is this about the wedding thing? Because if you're upset about that conversation, we can talk about it. Maybe we overreacted. Maybe we overreacted. Not we were wrong or we hurt you or we're sorry. Just the possibility that they had overreacted to my presumed social inadequacy. This isn't about the wedding, Jason. This is about me taking control of my own life and resources. I've decided to stop funding other people's choices and start making choices for myself. I don't understand what that means. It means I'm retiring from being taken for granted. Your cell phone service will also be disconnected at the end of the month unless you set up your own account. Your gym membership expires in 3 weeks and won't be renewed. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. When Jason finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of panic I hadn't heard since he was a child. "Mom, what's going on? This isn't like you. Are you having some kind of episode? Do you need me to come over?" An episode. The suggestion that my newfound self-respect was evidence of mental instability rather than long overdue clarity was so insulting that I almost laughed. "I'm fine, Jason. Better than fine, actually. I'm finally learning to value myself the way I've always valued other people. But these changes don't make sense. We're family. Family helps each other." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. Family does help each other. Family also includes each other in important decisions and celebrations. Family doesn't treat each other like embarrassments to be managed. Another long pause. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from confusion to something closer to anger. "So this is punishment for the wedding conversation. You're throwing a tantrum because we tried to be considerate of your comfort level." The dismissal in his voice, reducing my pain to a tantrum, my boundary setting to punishment, crystallized everything I had been trying to understand about how our relationship had deteriorated. "No, Jason. This is me finally understanding that being treated as an inconvenience is not the same as being loved. And accepting financial support from someone you're ashamed of is not the same as respecting them." I hung up before he could respond, turned off my phone, and returned to my dinner. The salmon was perfectly cooked, the wine was excellent, and the candles continued to cast their warm glow over a table set for someone who was finally learning to honor her own worth. For the first time in months, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, untroubled by anxiety about other people's feelings or guilt about choices I had every right to make. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a different person, not bitter or angry, but clear and purposeful in a way I hadn't experienced since John's death. I had tasted freedom, and it was intoxicating. 3 days after I had turned off my phone and enjoyed my first peaceful dinner in months, the pounding on my front door began at 7 o'clock on a Thursday morning. The sound was urgent, desperate, completely different from the polite knocking of someone making a social call. I knew without looking that Jason had finally understood the full implications of my withdrawal from his life. I took my time answering, finishing my morning coffee while the pounding continued, occasionally punctuated by muffled voices and what sounded like Claire's high-pitched protests about something. When I finally opened the door, I found not just Jason and Claire, but Claire's parents as well, Robert and Patricia Morrison, looking as if they had been summoned to handle a family emergency. Jason's face was flushed with anger and something that looked like genuine panic. His usually perfectly groomed hair was disheveled, and his expensive business shirt was wrinkled as if he had slept in it. Claire stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed defensively, her expression a mixture of irritation and embarrassment. Her parents flanked them like reinforcements, their faces carefully neutral but alert, as if they were preparing for negotiations with a hostile party. "Mom, we need to talk," Jason said, pushing past me into my living room without waiting for an invitation. "Now." The others followed, arranging themselves around my sitting area like an intervention committee. Patricia perched on the edge of my sofa as if afraid of contamination, while Robert remained standing near the fireplace, his posture suggesting he was ready to leave at the first opportunity. Claire chose the chair farthest from where I usually sat, making it clear that this was a confrontation rather than a family gathering. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," I said with deliberate politeness, settling into John's old armchair with the calm dignity of someone who was finally ready for this conversation. "Cut the act, Mom," Jason snapped, his voice carrying a harsh edge I had never heard directed at me before. "I know what you're trying to do, and it's not going to work." "I'm not trying to do anything except live my life according to my own values," I replied. "What seems to be the problem?" Claire leaned forward, her face tight with frustration. "The problem is that you're being vindictive and childish." Jason explained about the insurance and the phone, but this goes way beyond that. "We called the caterer yesterday to finalize the guest count, and they said you had contacted them directly to remove yourself from all wedding-related decisions." I had indeed called the caterer, along with the florist, the photographer, and the wedding planner. Not to cause problems, but to clarify that I would not be responsible for any costs or decisions related to the wedding. I had learned my lesson about making assumptions about my role in other people's events. I removed myself from financial responsibility for an event I'm not welcome to attend, I said simply. That seems reasonable to me. You are welcome, Jason exploded, jumping up from the sofa and beginning to pace around my living room like a caged animal. We never said you weren't welcome. We just thought you might be more comfortable at a separate, smaller event where I wouldn't embarrass you in front of your sophisticated friends. I finished for him. Yes, I remember the conversation clearly. Robert Morrison cleared his throat, his discomfort obvious as he attempted to mediate a situation he clearly wished he wasn't witnessing. Perhaps we're all overreacting here. Ellen, I'm sure there's been some miscommunication about the wedding arrangements. These things happen in all families during stressful planning periods. His tone was condescending in the way that successful men often use when they believe women are being emotional about trivial matters. The assumption that this was simply a miscommunication that could be smoothed over with proper management made my resolve harden even further. There's been no miscommunication, I said, my voice steady and clear. Your daughter and my son explicitly told me that I wasn't sophisticated enough for their wedding reception. They offered me a consolation brunch the following day as a more appropriate venue for someone of my social limitations. I'm simply accepting their assessment and acting accordingly. Patricia's carefully composed expression cracked slightly, revealing embarrassment that her daughter's cruelty had been stated so plainly in front of witnesses. Claire's face reddened, but whether from shame or anger was impossible to determine. That's not what we said, Claire protested, her voice rising defensively. We were trying to be considerate of your comfort level. The reception is going to be very formal, very business-focused. We thought you might find it overwhelming. Because I'm too unsophisticated to handle formal events or business conversations, I said, not as a question, but as a statement of the assumption underlying all their considerations. The silence that followed was deafening. No one denied the characterization because they couldn't. It was exactly what they had meant, even if they lacked the honesty to state it directly. Jason stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from anger to something closer to desperation. Fine. You want to come to the wedding? Come to the wedding. We'll seat you at the family table. You'll be included in all the photos. Everything will be exactly the way you want it. Just stop this scorched earth campaign you're waging. Scorched earth campaign. The phrase revealed everything about how he viewed my decision to protect myself, not as reasonable boundary setting, but as warfare designed to punish him for disappointing me. It's too late for that, Jason, I said quietly. You can't unsay the things you've said or unexpress the feelings you've revealed. You've shown me exactly how you see me, and I'm simply adjusting my behavior to match that reality. What does that mean? Claire demanded, her patience finally exhausted with what she clearly viewed as my stubborn refusal to accept their generous compromises. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, where I had placed the manila envelope Sandra had given me containing copies of all the legal documents we had prepared. I pulled out the revised will and held it in my hands, feeling its weight as both a practical document and a symbol of my newfound independence. It means I've updated my will, I said, turning back to face the group of people who had apparently never considered that their treatment of me might have consequences beyond hurt feelings. This house, which Jason has always assumed he would inherit, will now be donated to the Portland Rose Garden Society upon my death. The remainder of my estate will go to various charities that I believe will appreciate the gift. The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's carefully maintained composure crumbled entirely, her mouth falling open in undisguised shock. Robert stared at me as if I had just announced my intention to commit murder. Claire's face went pale, then flushed red with what looked like rage. But it was Jason's reaction that cut deepest. He didn't look hurt or disappointed, or even angry. He looked betrayed, as if I had violated some fundamental contract that guaranteed him access to my resources regardless of how he treated me. You can't be serious, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This house is our family home. It's my childhood, my memories, my inheritance. You can't just give it away to strangers. I can give my property to anyone I choose, I replied, "and I've chosen to give it to people who will value it appropriately." "But what about me?" Jason's voice cracked with an emotion I couldn't identify. "What about everything I've planned? Everything I've counted on? Claire and I have talked about raising our children here, about continuing the family traditions, about using the house I've maintained and the resources I've accumulated while excluding me from the family you're planning to raise here." I interrupted. "You want the benefits of having a mother without the inconvenience of actually treating me like one." Claire stood up abruptly, her composure finally shattered completely. "This is insane. You're destroying your own family over a simple disagreement about wedding logistics. Do you realize how selfish you're being? How cruel?" The accusation of selfishness coming from someone who had spent months planning a wedding while systematically excluding the groom's mother was so absurd that I almost laughed. "I'm being selfish?" I asked, genuinely curious about her reasoning. "By refusing to fund the lifestyle of people who are ashamed to be seen with me in public? By declining to leave my life's work to someone who considers me an embarrassment? How exactly is protecting myself from further humiliation selfish?" Robert Morrison stepped forward, his business training apparently kicking in as he attempted to find a practical solution to what he clearly viewed as a negotiation that had gotten out of hand. "Ellen, let's think about this rationally. You're upset. Understandably so, but making permanent legal changes based on temporary emotional reactions isn't wise. Why don't we all take some time to cool down, and then we can discuss this like civilized adults?" His patronizing tone and assumption that my decisions were based on temporary emotions, rather than clear-eyed assessment of my situation, pushed me past the point of polite endurance. "Mr. Morrison," I said, my voice taking on the steel I had learned to use during 40 years of nursing, when life-and-death situations required absolute clarity. "I am 73 years old. I have raised a child, nursed a husband through terminal illness, worked for 4 decades in a profession that requires constant decision-making under pressure, and managed my own household and finances for the past 5 years since my husband's death. I am not an emotional child having a tantrum. I am a competent adult making rational decisions about my own life and resources." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight, the recognition that they had underestimated both my resolve and my ability to follow through on my decisions. Jason sank back onto the sofa, his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red-rimmed with what might have been tears, or simply exhaustion from discovering that actions have consequences. "So what do you want?" he asked, his voice hollow with defeat. "What will it take to fix this? To go back to the way things were?" The question revealed everything about how little he understood the situation. He still believed this was a problem that could be solved through negotiation, a conflict that could be resolved by offering me sufficient concessions to buy back my compliance with his preferences. "There is no going back," I said gently, feeling sadness for the relationship we might have had if he had chosen differently. "You can't unknow what you know about how I really see you, and I can't unknow what I know about how you really see me. But we're family," he said, the word carrying desperate weight, as if blood relationship alone should override all other considerations. "Yes," I agreed, "we are family. And someday, perhaps, we might figure out how to be family in a way that includes mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than obligation and entitlement. But that day isn't today." I walked to the front door and opened it, the morning air cool and fresh against my face. "I think this conversation has gone as far as it can go for now. You all have a wedding to plan, and I have a life to rebuild." One by one, they filed out of my house, their faces reflecting varying degrees of shock, anger, and confusion. Jason was the last to leave, pausing in the doorway to look back at me with an expression I couldn't read. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I know you do," I replied, "but love without respect isn't enough anymore." After they left, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of everything that had just transpired. For the first time in months, my house felt truly peaceful, not empty, but free from the tension of relationships built on false foundations. I had finally learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I was no longer afraid of either one. The morning after the confrontation, I woke up to sunlight streaming through my bedroom windows, the same sunlight that had greeted me every morning for 23 years. But somehow it felt different now, warmer, more welcoming, as if the house itself was breathing easier without the weight of unspoken resentments and unfulfilled expectations pressing down on its walls. For the first time in months, I had slept through the entire night without waking at 3 a.m. to replay conversations or worry about relationships that seemed to require constant tending, but never seemed to grow stronger despite my efforts. The silence in my house was no longer the hollow echo of abandonment. It was the peaceful quiet of someone who had finally stopped waiting for other people to validate her existence. I made my coffee slowly, savoring the ritual of measuring grounds and listening to the familiar sounds of percolation. The kitchen felt larger somehow, as if removing myself from other people's obligations had created physical space as well as emotional freedom. I sat at my table with the morning paper, actually reading the articles instead of simply scanning headlines, while my mind churned through anxiety about Jason's happiness or Claire's approval. The local news section contained a small article about the Portland Rose Garden Society's spring fundraising campaign, and I found myself smiling as I read about their plans for expanding the Heritage Rose collection. These people understood the value of preservation, the importance of tending something beautiful for its own sake, rather than for what it might provide in return. My house and gardens would be in good hands when the time came. After breakfast, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my old friend Margaret Walsh, a fellow nurse who had retired the same year I did, but had stayed in touch despite my gradual withdrawal from social activities during Jason's increasingly demanding adult life. "Ellen Riley!" Margaret's voice bubbled with genuine pleasure when she recognized my voice. "I was just thinking about you last week. How are you doing, honey?" The question, asked with real interest and affection, nearly brought me to tears. When was the last time someone had asked about my well-being because they actually cared about the answer rather than because it was socially required? "I'm doing better than I have in a long time," I said, and realized it was completely true. "Margaret, would you like to have lunch this week? I feel like I've been hiding from life for too long." "I would love that. How about Thursday at that little cafe on Hawthorne we used to go to after our shifts? They still make those amazing vegetable quiches you always ordered." The fact that she remembered my favorite menu item from a restaurant we hadn't visited in 3 years struck me as remarkable. Here was a friendship that had survived despite neglect, a connection that didn't require constant management or careful navigation of emotional landmines. Thursday's lunch with Margaret became a revelation about what healthy relationships actually looked like. We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories about retirement adjustments, health concerns, books we'd been reading, and grandchildren Margaret was helping to raise while her daughter worked full-time. The conversation flowed naturally, without the careful editing I had grown accustomed to during interactions with Jason and Claire. "You look different," Margaret said as we walked to our cars after lunch. "Lighter somehow, less burdened." "I've been making some changes," I admitted, learning to put my own needs first for once. Margaret studied my face with the keen perception of someone who had spent decades reading people's unspoken struggles. "Good for you. We spend so many years taking care of everyone else that we forget we deserve care too. It's never too late to remember your own worth." That afternoon, I did something that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I drove to a local community college and enrolled in a watercolor painting class that met twice a week for 8 weeks. I had always been drawn to art, but had never allowed myself the time or resources to pursue creative interests that seemed frivolous compared to the practical demands of work and family responsibilities. The art supply store overwhelmed me with its abundance of possibilities. Brushes in dozens of sizes, tubes of paint in colors I didn't know had names, papers with different textures and weights designed for different techniques. The young woman behind the counter helped me select a beginner's kit, her enthusiasm for art infectious as she explained the properties of different materials. "Are you starting painting for the first time?" she asked while ringing up my purchases. "I'm starting a lot of things for the first time," I replied, surprised by the truth of that statement. My first painting class was held in a sunny classroom filled with women of all ages, from recent retirees like myself to young mothers who had arranged childcare to pursue their artistic interests. Our instructor, a gentlewoman named Susan who wore paint-stained aprons like badges of honor, began the session by having us introduce ourselves and share what had brought us to the class. "I'm Ellen," I said when my turn came. "I'm here because I've spent most of my life believing that other people's needs were more important than my own interests. I'm trying to learn what it feels like to do something purely because it brings me joy." The nods of understanding around the room told me I wasn't alone in this experience. Several other women shared similar stories: divorce, empty nest syndrome, retirement from careers that had consumed their identities, the death of spouses who had been the center of their worlds. We were all learning to discover who we were when we weren't defined by our relationships to other people. Over the following weeks, painting became more than a hobby. It became a form of meditation, a way of being present in the moment without worrying about past mistakes or future complications. My early attempts were clumsy and amateur, but each session taught me something new about color, light, and the patience required to create something beautiful. "Don't worry about making it perfect," Susan advised during my third class, when I was struggling with a landscape that refused to match my vision. "Art isn't about perfection. It's about expression, about capturing something true, even if it's not technically accurate." The lesson felt applicable to life in general. I had spent decades trying to be the perfect mother, the perfect wife, the perfect support system for other people's dreams. Perhaps it was time to try being authentically myself instead, even if that version was messier and more complicated than the role I had been playing. 2 weeks after beginning painting class, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in my garden, deadheading roses and enjoying the late afternoon sunshine, when I heard footsteps on the path behind me. I turned to find Emma Chen, Sandra's 22-year-old daughter, approaching with a shy smile and a small potted plant in her hands. "Mrs. Riley? I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. Mom told me about some of the changes you've been making. I wanted to thank you." Emma had been 8 years old when I helped her grandmother navigate the healthcare system during her final illness. I had spent countless hours at the hospital, translating medical terminology for a family struggling with language barriers and unfamiliar procedures. Emma's grandmother had spoken only Mandarin, and the medical staff had been overwhelmed and sometimes impatient with the communication challenges. "Thank me for what, sweetheart?" "For teaching me about advocacy," Emma said, settling onto the garden bench beside me. "For showing me that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is help them understand their options and support their decisions, even when those decisions are difficult." As she handed me the small plant, a lavender start that she had grown herself, "I'm in nursing school now because of you. I watched how you treated my grandmother with such dignity and kindness, how you made sure her voice was heard even when she couldn't speak English. You showed me what nursing could be." I held the small plant carefully, touched by the connection between a kindness I had barely remembered and a young woman's career choice. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman. I was honored to help her family during such a difficult time. Mom says you're going through your own difficult time now. Family stuff." Emma's voice carried the careful diplomacy of someone who understood that family problems were complicated and personal. "I just wanted you to know that the kindness you showed us had consequences you probably never knew about. You changed my life." After Emma left, I planted the lavender start in a sunny spot near my kitchen window, where I would see it every morning, and remember that love and kindness, when given freely and without expectation of return, could bloom in ways we never anticipated. That evening, I made a decision that would have terrified me just months earlier. I called a travel agent and booked a 10-day trip to Ireland, something I had dreamed about since John and I had watched a PBS special about Irish gardens years ago. John's illness and death had put travel plans on indefinite hold, and Jason's needs had consumed whatever discretionary income might have funded such adventures. But now, for the first time in my adult life, my money was my own to spend as I chose. The trip would happen in the fall, giving me something to anticipate that belonged entirely to me. The travel agent, a cheerful woman named Beth, was delighted to help plan my solo adventure. "Ireland is perfect for independent travelers," she assured me. "The people are warm and welcoming, and there's so much beauty to discover. Are you interested in gardens, castles, historic sites?" "All of it," I said. feeling giddy with the freedom to choose activities based purely on my own interests. I want to see everything. As spring progressed into early summer, my life took on a rhythm that felt both familiar and entirely new. Morning coffee and newspaper reading, followed by time in my garden, which was blooming more spectacularly than it had in years. Twice weekly painting classes where I was slowly learning to trust my artistic instincts. Lunch dates with Margaret and other friends I had been neglecting during my years of single-minded focus on Jason's happiness. I joined a book club at the local library, where thoughtful discussions about literature reminded me how much I had missed intellectual stimulation that didn't revolve around family obligations. I volunteered at the Children's Hospital, reading stories to young patients, and remembering why I had chosen nursing as a profession, not for the recognition or gratitude, but for the simple satisfaction of helping people during vulnerable moments. Most surprisingly, I discovered that I enjoyed my own company in ways I never had before. Evenings that would once have felt lonely now felt peaceful. Dinners prepared for one person became opportunities to experiment with recipes and flavors I had never tried when cooking for others with more conservative tastes. The phone calls from Jason stopped after the second week, when it became clear that I would not be drawn into arguments or negotiations about my decisions. Claire's attempt to involve her parents as mediators had failed when I politely but firmly declined their invitation to a family discussion about resolving our differences. I was learning that some differences couldn't be resolved through compromise, not when they involved fundamental questions about dignity and respect. Some relationships had to be rebuilt from the ground up or not at all. 3 weeks before Jason's wedding date, which I now knew was June 15th, thanks to a save-the-date card that had been forwarded to me by mistake, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I had learned about setting boundaries and maintaining them. The voice on the other end was young, nervous, and vaguely familiar. "Mrs. Riley, this is Tyler Chen, Emma's cousin. We met at the hospital a few years ago when my great-grandmother was sick." I remembered Tyler, a shy teenager who had spent hours holding his great-grandmother's hand while she received treatment. He would be in college now, if I calculated correctly. "Of course, Tyler. How are you? How's your family?" "We're all good, thank you." "Mrs. Riley, I'm calling because, well, this is kind of awkward, but I work part-time at the catering company that's handling your son's wedding. I heard some conversations that I thought you should know about." My stomach clenched with anticipation of fresh humiliation, but I kept my voice steady. "What kind of conversations?" "They've been asking about you. The bride's family, I mean. Whether you're planning to show up uninvited, whether they need security to handle any disruptions you might cause. They seem to think you're going to make some kind of scene." The assumption that I would crash my own son's wedding like some unhinged stalker was both insulting and revealing. Even now, even after everything that had happened, they still couldn't conceive of a world in which I might have my own life to live, my own plans to pursue, my own sources of happiness that had nothing to do with them. "Thank you for telling me, Tyler. I appreciate you thinking of me. Are you going to be okay? I mean, I know this must be really hard." His genuine concern, coming from someone who barely knew me but remembered kindness I had shown his family, was more meaningful than months of obligatory contact from my own son. "I'm going to be fine," I said, and realized I meant it completely. I'm going to be better than fine. June 15th dawned clear and beautiful, perfect weather for an outdoor wedding. I spent the morning in my garden, harvesting vegetables for a salad that would accompany the salmon I planned to grill for dinner. I had invited Margaret and 2 other friends from my painting class for an impromptu garden party, a celebration of friendship and beautiful weather, and the simple joy of being surrounded by people who valued my company. While Jason and Claire exchanged vows in front of 200 carefully selected guests, I sat in my garden with women who appreciated both my cooking and my conversation, laughing about our painting instructor's latest critique of our artistic efforts, and planning a group visit to a museum exhibition we all wanted to see. It wasn't until late that evening, as I was cleaning up the dinner dishes, that I allowed myself to think about what was happening just 15 miles away at the elegant venue where my son was celebrating the beginning of his married life without me. For a moment, I felt the familiar stab of exclusion, the old pain of being unwanted, but the feeling passed quickly, replaced by something I was still learning to recognize: relief. I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by people who saw me clearly and chose my company freely. I was no longer trying to earn love that should have been given freely, no longer accepting crumbs of affection and calling them feasts. For the first time in my adult life, I was enough exactly as I was. And that felt like the most beautiful kind of freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the cliffs of Moher in County Clare, Ireland, watching the Atlantic Ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon, while wind whipped through my hair and filled my lungs with the sharp, clean taste of freedom. The emerald landscape around me was more breathtaking than any photograph could capture, and I realized that some experiences could only be fully appreciated when you were brave enough to claim them for yourself. The trip had exceeded every expectation I had dared to form. 10 days of exploring ancient castles, walking through gardens that had been tended for centuries, and discovering that I was perfectly capable of navigating foreign countries, managing currency exchanges, and finding my way through unfamiliar cities without anyone's help or guidance. I had eaten meals alone in restaurants without feeling self-conscious, struck up conversations with fellow travelers from around the world, and learned that solitude and loneliness were entirely different experiences. In a small village near Cork, I had spent an afternoon painting watercolors of a medieval church while sitting in its peaceful cemetery, surrounded by headstones that told stories of lives lived and loves lost over hundreds of years. An elderly Irish woman named Bridget had approached me as I worked, curious about my art and generous with stories about the families buried there. "Are you traveling alone, love?" she had asked, settling onto the stone wall beside me with the ease of someone who considered the entire village her personal living room. "I am," I had replied, continuing to work on the delicate spire that kept eluding my efforts to capture its Gothic details. "Brave woman," Bridget had said with obvious approval. "Too many people wait for others to give them permission to live their lives. Good for you for giving yourself permission instead." Her words had settled into my heart, like seeds finding fertile ground, taking root alongside all the other small revelations this journey had provided about my own strength and resilience. Now, back home in Portland, my house felt both familiar and transformed. The rooms looked the same, but the atmosphere had changed completely. Where once there had been the heavy silence of waiting and disappointment, now there was the peaceful quiet of contentment. The walls seemed to exhale gratitude for finally housing someone who appreciated both their shelter and their history. My easel stood in the living room now, positioned near the large front window where natural light could illuminate whatever painting project I was currently exploring. Canvases in various stages of completion lined the walls, landscapes from my Ireland trip, still lifes of flowers from my garden, experimental abstracts that emerged when I gave myself permission to play with color and form, without worrying about creating anything recognizable or impressive. The dining room table, which had once been set with my best china only for special occasions that never seemed special enough, now featured fresh flowers from my garden every day, cloth napkins instead of paper ones, and whatever interesting pottery I discovered at local craft fairs. I had learned that every day I woke up healthy and capable was special enough to warrant celebration. Margaret had become not just a friend, but a true companion in this journey of rediscovering who I was beyond my roles as mother, wife, and caregiver. We had established Thursday lunch dates that were sacred to both of us, creating space for conversations that ranged from books we were reading to places we wanted to travel to, reflections on how we had survived the various challenges life had presented. "You're glowing," she had said during our most recent lunch. "I don't mean that in some mystical way. I mean literally. Your skin looks healthier, your eyes are brighter, even your posture is different. Happiness suits you." The observation had made me realize that I couldn't remember the last time I had checked my appearance with the anxious eye of someone wondering whether she looked appropriate for other people's approval. These days, I dressed for my own comfort and pleasure, choosing colors that made me smile and fabrics that felt good against my skin rather than outfits designed to send messages about my respectability or social awareness. My painting instructor, Susan, had become another unexpected source of wisdom and encouragement. During our final class session of the fall semester, she had pulled me aside to comment on my artistic progress. "Your technique has improved dramatically," she had said, studying my latest landscape with the serious attention of someone who understood that art was about more than pretty pictures. But more importantly, your willingness to take risks has grown. These early paintings were very careful, very controlled. These recent ones show someone who's not afraid to make bold choices, even if they don't always work perfectly. The observation applied to more than my artwork. I had indeed become someone willing to make bold choices, to risk imperfection in pursuit of authenticity, to value growth over safety. The book club had introduced me to authors and ideas I would never have discovered on my own, and the discussions had reminded me how much I enjoyed intellectual challenges that didn't involve managing other people's emotions or solving family crises. The women in the group came from diverse backgrounds and brought perspectives that expanded my understanding of everything from historical fiction to contemporary social issues. My volunteer work at the Children's Hospital had evolved into something more substantial than occasional story reading. I had been trained as a patient advocate, helping families navigate complex medical decisions and insurance challenges, work that utilized skills I had developed during my nursing career, while serving people who genuinely needed and appreciated the assistance. The children I worked with reminded me daily that resilience could coexist with vulnerability, that courage often wore the face of someone small and frightened who chose to keep fighting anyway. Their bravery in the face of serious illness put my own challenges into perspective and reinforced my conviction that life was too precious to waste on relationships that diminished rather than nourished the spirit. 3 weeks before Christmas, as I was addressing holiday cards to friends I had reconnected with and new acquaintances who had enriched my life over the past year, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Jason standing on my front porch, looking older than his 31 years, and carrying a small wrapped package that he held like an offering. He had lost weight since I had last seen him, and his usually impeccable grooming showed signs of stress: wrinkled shirt, hair that needed cutting, eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. But more than his physical appearance, his entire demeanor seemed different. The confident entitlement that had characterized our last encounter had been replaced by something that looked remarkably like humility. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I know I don't have any right to just show up here, but I was hoping we could talk." I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or desperation that might suggest this was another attempt to restore the old dynamic where my love could be taken for granted. Instead, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine uncertainty, the vulnerability of someone who understood that he had damaged something precious and wasn't sure it could be repaired. "Come in," I said, stepping aside to let him enter the house where he had grown up, but where he was no longer automatically welcome. He stopped in the living room, taking in the changes I had made: the easel and paintings, the fresh flowers, the comfortable rearrangement of furniture that prioritized my own preferences over traditional entertaining expectations. His eyes lingered on a watercolor I had painted of the Irish coastline, recognizing in it evidence of experiences he knew nothing about. "You went to Ireland," he said, not quite a question. "I did. It was wonderful. I didn't know you were interested in travel. Or painting." His voice carried a note of discovery, as if he were meeting a stranger who happened to live in his childhood home. "There are a lot of things about me you don't know," I replied, settling into my favorite chair and gesturing for him to sit wherever he felt comfortable. "You've been seeing me as Mom for so long that you forgot I was also Ellen, a person with interests and dreams and needs that existed independently of my relationship to you." He sat on the edge of the sofa, still clutching the small package, his posture suggesting he was prepared to leave quickly if this conversation went badly. "I've been thinking about that," he said slowly. "About a lot of things, actually. The wedding was—" He paused, searching for words. "It was beautiful, but it felt incomplete. Wrong somehow. Not because of the logistics or the planning, but because you weren't there." I waited for him to continue, curious about where this revelation was leading, but not willing to make it easier for him by filling the silence with reassurances. "Claire and I have been having problems," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not because of you exactly, but because of what your absence forced us to confront about ourselves, about how we treat people, about what we value, about the kind of family we want to build." He set the package on the coffee table between us, but didn't offer it yet. "I keep thinking about something you said during our last conversation, About love without respect not being enough. I didn't understand what you meant then, but I think I'm starting to. What do you think it means? I asked, genuinely curious about his interpretation. I think it means that love without respect is just another form of using someone. That saying "I love you" doesn't give you permission to treat someone badly, or to take them for granted, or to assume they'll always be available no matter how you behave. His voice cracked slightly. I think it means I've been using your love as an excuse to avoid treating you with the dignity you deserve. The acknowledgement hung in the air between us, fragile and significant. I could see that admitting this truth had cost him something. Perhaps his comfortable narrative about being a loving son who had simply been trying to manage a difficult family situation. And what do you want to do with that understanding? I asked. I want to try again, he said, finally meeting my eyes directly. Not to go back to the way things were because you're right. That wasn't working for either of us. But to try building something new, something based on actually knowing each other as people rather than just playing the roles of mother and son. He picked up the package and held it out to me. This isn't a Christmas present exactly. It's more of an apology or maybe a hope. Inside the wrapping paper was a small framed photograph I had never seen before. A candid shot of me reading to Jason when he was perhaps 4 years old. We were sitting in the rocking chair that used to be in his bedroom, my arms around him, his small head resting against my shoulder. The image captured a moment of pure contentment, before the complications of growing up had taught us that love could be conditional or insufficient. I found this in a box of old photos when Claire and I were moving to a new apartment, he said. Looking at it reminded me of who you were to me before I decided you weren't sophisticated enough for my new life. It reminded me that the woman in this picture deserved better than what I gave her. I studied the photograph, remembering not that specific moment, but hundreds like it. Quiet evenings when the love between us had been simple and unquestioned. When my value to him hadn't been measured against external standards or social expectations. It's a beautiful photo, I said, setting it on the table beside my chair where I could continue to see it. Thank you for sharing it with me. Mom, he said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who needed to say something important. I know I hurt you badly. I know I took your love for granted and treated you as if you were embarrassing instead of precious. I know saying I'm sorry isn't enough to fix what I broke. He paused, gathering courage for whatever he wanted to say next. But I'm hoping it might be enough to start over. Not as the people we were before, but as the people we could become if we both tried harder to see each other clearly. I looked at my son, really looked at him, for the first time in years. Not through the lens of maternal obligation or disappointment, but as one adult assessing another adult's capacity for growth and change. What I saw was someone who had been humbled by consequences, who had lost something he hadn't valued properly until it was gone, who was asking for a chance to prove he had learned from his mistakes. Starting over would mean building a relationship based on mutual respect, I said carefully. It would mean accepting that I have a life and interests that don't revolve around you, and that my worth isn't determined by how well I fit into your social world. I understand that, he said quickly. I want that. I want to know who you are when you're not busy taking care of everyone else. I want to hear about Ireland and your painting and whatever books you're reading. I want to be someone worthy of your time and attention rather than someone who just expects it. And it would mean accepting that I've made legal and financial decisions based on protecting myself from being taken for granted again. I continued. The will changes, the financial boundaries. Those aren't punishments I'm willing to negotiate away to restore your comfort. His face showed a flicker of old disappointment, but he nodded. I understand. I don't like it. But I understand why you felt you had to protect yourself. And honestly, maybe learning to see you as someone other than a future inheritance will help me appreciate who you are right now. We talked for 2 more hours, carefully and honestly about what a rebuilt relationship might look like. Not the restoration of old patterns, but the creation of something entirely new based on who we actually were rather than who we had been, or who we thought we should be. When he left, we didn't hug or make dramatic declarations of forgiveness and reconciliation. Instead, we made plans to meet for coffee the following week. Neutral territory where we could continue learning to see each other without the weight of shared history, making every interaction feel loaded with significance. As I watched him walk to his car, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: hope for a future relationship with my son that might actually bring joy to both of us. That evening, I called Margaret to tell her about the unexpected visit. "How do you feel?" she asked after I had described the conversation. "Cautiously optimistic," I said honestly, "but also clear that my happiness doesn't depend on whether he follows through on his promises. I've built a life that satisfies me regardless of whether Jason chooses to be part of it respectfully." "That's the difference," Margaret said with the wisdom of someone who had also learned to value herself appropriately. "You're not negotiating from desperation anymore. You're choosing from strength." 6 months later, as I write this story, Jason and I meet for coffee every other week. Our conversations are still careful sometimes, still require navigation around old wounds and new boundaries. But they're genuine in a way our interactions hadn't been for years. He asks about my painting progress and my travel plans. I ask about his work and his marriage, which is slowly healing as he and Claire learn to build something based on honesty rather than social performance. Claire and I may never be close, but she has stopped treating me as a problem to be managed and started treating me as a person deserving of basic courtesy. It's not the relationship I once hoped for, but it's respectful enough to make family gatherings possible without compromising my dignity. More importantly, I've learned that family love, like romantic love, can only thrive when it includes respect, consideration, and the willingness to see each other as complete human beings, rather than collections of roles and expectations. I've learned that saying no to treatment that diminishes you isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining relationships that actually nourish rather than drain your spirit. I've learned that the love you give yourself sets the standard for the love you'll accept from others, and that people who truly care about you will rise to meet that standard rather than asking you to lower it for their convenience. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be before other people's needs convinced you to become smaller, quieter, less demanding of the respect and consideration that every human being deserves. To anyone listening who recognizes themselves in my story, who has spent years accepting crumbs of affection while providing feasts of love, who has been told they're asking too much when they ask to be valued appropriately, I want you to know this: you are enough. You always were enough, and you deserve relationships that celebrate that truth rather than asking you to apologize for it. The people who truly love you will not be threatened by your decision to love yourself as well. They will not ask you to choose between your own dignity and their comfort. They will not treat your self-respect as a problem to be solved rather than a strength to be honored. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who take you for granted is to show them what life looks like without your constant availability to absorb their indifference. Sometimes you have to disappear so they can finally see you. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, they'll realize what they nearly lost and work to become worthy of what they almost threw away. But even if they don't, you'll still have the most important thing of all: a life lived with dignity, respect, and the unshakable knowledge that you matter exactly as much as anyone else. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, accepting less love than you gave because you were afraid of being alone? Tell me about it in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel so we can share this message with others who might need to hear it. Sometimes the story that saves us is the one that reminds us we're not alone in our struggles, and that change is always possible when we find the courage to value ourselves appropriately.